The alarm on my wrist device buzzed 3 times before I even opened my eyes, and I knew that pattern. Only one office in the entire solar system used that pattern, and it was not an office I ever wanted to hear from again. I sat up in the dark, heart already pounding, and read the message glowing on the small screen. Report to the Grand Spire within 6 hours. Council session called early. Your presence is mandatory, not optional. I read it twice to make sure I was not imagining things. Then I laughed. A short, humorless laugh that echoed off the walls of my small apartment. Mandatory. They had never once used that word with me before. For 20 years, since the day I signed my discharge papers and walked away from the uniform, nobody in any government office had ever used the word mandatory when it came to me. I was a private citizen, a retired soldier with a bad knee and a habit of waking up at every loud noise. And now, 6 hours to report to the most powerful room in known space. I did not bother finishing my coffee. I pulled my old service jacket from the back of the closet, not because I needed the uniform, but because touching the fabric helped me think straight, the way some people needed a cup of tea to calm their nerves. My fingers found the small tear near the left shoulder, a memory stitched into cloth, and for a moment, the tiredness in my body was replaced by something sharper. Focus. I had learned a long time ago that when the universe hands you 6 hours instead of 6 days, it usually means somebody upstairs is scared, and scared people make decisions that get other people killed. I was not going to let that happen again if I could help it. The transport ship that came for me was sleek, silver, and completely silent, nothing like the rattling troop carriers I remembered from my service days. A young officer named Grace Ellery greeted me at the ramp, her uniform crisp, her eyes darting nervously between me and her datapad. She was human, one of the newer generation who had grown up after the worst of the fighting, and I could tell she did not quite know what to make of me. To her, I was probably just an old name in a file, a legend that had been quietly retired and mostly forgotten. "Sergeant Daniel Hale," she said, reading from her pad as if she needed the words in front of her to believe them. "You have been selected as humanity's newest council observer, effective immediately." I did not answer right away. I looked past her, out through the wide viewport at the curve of the planet below, blue and green and achingly familiar, and I thought about all the people who were not standing on that ramp with me anymore. "Selected," I finally said. "That is an interesting word for it." She did not understand the joke, and I did not explain it. Some things are not meant to be explained to people who were not there. The flight to the Grand Spire took 11 hours, and Grace spent most of it trying to brief me on protocol. Do not speak unless recognized by the presiding voice. Do not make direct physical contact with delegates from species that consider it an insult. Do not raise your voice, ever, regardless of provocation. I listened to all of it, nodding at the right moments, but my mind kept drifting back to the last time I had been inside that building. It had been 15 years since my only other visit, and that visit had ended with me being escorted out by security after I said something no one in that chamber wanted to hear. I wondered if any of the delegates in that room today would remember that. I wondered if it would matter. When the Grand Spire finally came into view, it looked exactly as I remembered, an impossible structure of light and metal rising out of a neutral asteroid station, built by no single species but maintained by all of them, a monument to cooperation that had somehow survived 1,000 years of distrust. It was beautiful in the way that a loaded weapon is beautiful, elegant, and precise, and utterly capable of ending everything you cared about with a single wrong move. I had seen what happened when the people inside that building made the wrong call. I still saw it sometimes, when I closed my eyes at night. Grace led me through corridors lined with flags from 100 worlds, none of them familiar to her, all of them heavy with memory for me. We passed a display case containing what looked like a piece of shattered hull plating, and I recognized it instantly, my chest tightening before I could stop the reaction. That piece of metal had come from a ship I served on, salvaged after the long night, and placed here as some kind of memorial, a museum piece for people who had never smelled smoke or heard the sound a hull makes when it starts to fail. Grace noticed me slow down and asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that keeps a person moving forward instead of standing still and drowning in the past. We reached the entrance to the main chamber, 2 enormous doors carved from a dark stone that seemed to absorb the light around it, and Grace stopped, suddenly unsure of herself. "This is as far as I go," she said. "You go in alone from here." I nodded, straightened my jacket out of old habit, and reached for the door handle. But before I could touch it, the doors opened on their own, revealing a room far larger and far more crowded than I had expected for an emergency session. Rows of seats curved around a central floor in a shape like an open shell, each seat marked with the emblem of a different species. Some I recognized immediately, others I had never seen before in my life. The air itself felt different from anywhere else I had been, filtered and processed to accommodate a dozen different types of lungs, carrying a faint chemical scent that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just strange. Every single seat was occupied, and every single occupant turned to look at me the moment I stepped through the doorway. I felt the weight of 1,000 unfamiliar eyes settle onto my shoulders like a physical thing, and for one brief moment I understood exactly how a lone soldier must feel walking into enemy territory with no weapon and no backup. Except this time the danger was not a blade or a blast, it was something far more patient. Whispers moved through the chamber in languages I did not understand, but I did not need to understand the words to read the tone. Surprise. Doubt. In more than a few seats, something close to contempt. A tall, elegant delegate near the front, her skin a pale shimmering silver, watched me with an expression of polite disbelief, as though someone had accidentally let a stray animal wander into a formal dinner. I would learn later that her name was Ivrena, matriarch of the Thessari, one of the oldest and most respected voices in the entire council. At that moment, I only knew her as the woman whose eyes carried more judgment in a single glance than most people manage in a lifetime. Nearby, another delegate leaned toward his companion and spoke just loudly enough for the universal translator strapped to my ear to pick it up. "A soldier," he said, his tone dripping with something between amusement and disdain. "They sent a soldier to sit among diplomats." How thoroughly predictable of them. I did not turn my head to see who had spoken. I had heard worse from people who meant it far more personally, and I had survived every single time. Words in a chamber like this could not break bone, and after everything I had lived through, that made them almost gentle by comparison. The presiding voice, an ancient being whose species I still could not identify, even after staring directly at them, gestured toward an empty seat, marked with the symbol of Earth, positioned near the outer edge of the chamber, distant enough from the center that the placement itself felt like a small, deliberate insult. "Observer Hale," the presiding voice said, their tone flat and unreadable. "You may take your seat. The session will begin shortly." I walked across that open floor slowly, deliberately, refusing to let my bad knee show even the smallest hint of a limp, because I understood something these delegates did not yet know about me. Every step I took in that room was being measured, weighed, and filed away as evidence of who I was and what I represented. I was not just a man walking to a chair. I was, whether I liked it or not, the entire weight of my species compressed into a single pair of boots on cold polished stone, and I intended to carry that weight the same way I had carried every other burden placed on me, without complaint and without apology. I reached my seat and sat down, and only then did I allow myself a slow breath, the kind I had learned to take in moments just before something important was about to happen, whether on a battlefield or in a boardroom. I glanced around the chamber one more time, cataloging faces the way I had once cataloged terrain, learning who watched me openly, and who pretended not to watch me at all. Somewhere in this room, I already suspected, sat the people who had voted, all those years ago, to leave humanity waiting for 11 long months, while good men and women died on a world called Kes Verith Prime. I had never forgotten their faces from the old records. I doubted I would forget the new ones either. The presiding voice rose slightly from their seat, and the murmuring throughout the chamber died away almost instantly, replaced by an expectant silence that pressed against my ears like a change in air pressure. "This emergency session," the presiding voice announced, "has been called to address an urgent matter concerning colonial stability along the outer boundary." I noticed several delegates shift in their seats at those words, a subtle tension rippling outward, and I felt my own body go still, in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with instinct. I had spent enough years reading a room before the shooting started to recognize the feeling now, even in a place built entirely out of glass and light instead of steel and stone. Ivrena rose next, graceful and composed, her voice carrying easily across the chamber without any need to raise it. "Before we proceed," she said, "I believe introductions are in order. It seems Earth has sent us something new. A soldier, seated among us as though he belongs." Several delegates laughed softly at that, a polite, cutting sound that was somehow worse than open mockery. I did not react. I had learned patience the hard way, in places where impatience got people killed, and I was not about to abandon that lesson now over a few dismissive laughs in a comfortable room. The Corveth delegate, a broad, armored figure with deep red plating across his chest, spoke next without waiting to be recognized, an act that clearly ruffled a few feathers among the more formal members present. "Humanity has always struggled with restraint," he said, his voice a low mechanical rumble. "Perhaps they believe sending us one of their soldiers will remind us of their military strength. I assure you, it does not impress me." I felt something tighten low in my chest, not anger exactly, but a kind of old, familiar readiness, the same feeling I used to get standing at the edge of a drop zone waiting for the signal to move. I kept my hands folded in my lap, and my expression neutral, and I said absolutely nothing, because I had already decided, somewhere on that 11-hour flight, that I would not waste my first words in this chamber defending myself against insults. I would save them for something that actually mattered. The presiding voice called the session to formal order, and the true business of the day began, a long recitation of trade disputes and border adjustments that meant very little to me and, I suspected, very little to most of the room either. I sat quietly through nearly 2 hours of it, listening more than watching, letting the rhythms of council speech settle into my ears the way the rhythms of gunfire once settled into my bones, until I could almost predict which delegate would object to which proposal before they even opened their mouths. It was near the end of that second hour, just as the chamber's energy had begun to soften into the comfortable boredom of routine business, that an aide hurried onto the floor and handed a small data slate to the presiding voice. I watched the ancient being's expression change, subtle but unmistakable, the way a calm sky changes just before a storm arrives, and I felt every muscle in my body go quietly, completely alert. Whatever was on that slate, I understood instantly, was the real reason this emergency session had been called at all. Everything before this moment had simply been the room clearing its throat. The presiding voice set the slate down and looked out over the chamber, and when they spoke again, their voice carried a weight that silenced even the last few whispered conversations in the back rows. "A new resolution has been submitted for immediate vote," they said. "It concerns the authorization of a pacification fleet to be deployed against a rebelling colony population in the outer boundary territories." I felt the air leave my lungs slowly, carefully, the way I had trained myself to breathe when the ground beneath me suddenly became unstable. I did not yet know the name of that colony world. I did not need to know it yet to understand, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that my quiet, uneventful first day in that chamber had just come to an end. The name of the colony world came a moment later, spoken aloud by an aide standing near the presiding voice, and the sound of it hit me harder than I expected. Meridian's Rest, a settlement of nearly 40,000 people, most of them human, established almost 30 years ago on a quiet world, with 2 moons, and soil that grew wheat better than anywhere else in that sector. I had never been there myself, but I had heard about it from a woman I once served with, Laura Bennett, who had a cousin among the original settlers. Laura used to talk about that place like it was paradise, a fresh start, far from the noise of old wars. Now, apparently, its people had done something to anger the council enough to warrant the word pacification, a word that in my experience had never once meant anything peaceful. I kept my expression still, but inside my chest something had shifted, cold and sharp, like a blade sliding free of its sheath. I did not yet know the details of what had happened on Meridian's Rest, and I understood enough about diplomacy to know that jumping to conclusions before hearing the facts was a mistake that got soldiers killed just as often as it got them decorated. So I listened. I listened harder than I had listened to anything in the 2 hours before, every word from every delegate suddenly carrying the weight of a life I might never meet, but was somehow already responsible for. The Corveth delegate spoke first on the matter, his mechanical voice carrying an easy confidence that told me this was not the first time he had pushed for exactly this kind of resolution. "The settlers of Meridian's Rest," he said, have refused 3 separate directives from the Regional Trade Authority regarding resource allocation. They have armed local militias in direct violation of council settlement agreements. This is not a request for dialogue. This is a demand for order. I felt my jaw tighten at the phrase armed local militias, because I had read enough history, both old and painfully recent, to know exactly how often that phrase got used to describe frightened farmers who had picked up whatever tools they could find to protect their families from something far more dangerous than a trade dispute. Ivrena rose again, her silver skin catching the chamber's soft light in a way that made her look almost otherworldly, which I supposed, in the truest sense, she was. "The Thessari have long experience managing rebellious colonies," she said, her tone smooth and reasonable, in a way that somehow made the coming violence sound like simple housekeeping. "A measured show of force, applied early, prevents far greater conflict later. This is not punishment, it is prevention." I had heard that argument before too, dressed up in different words by different people wearing different uniforms, and it had never once made the outcome any less bloody for the people on the receiving end of that measured show of force. I glanced sideways at the human seats scattered throughout the chamber, the handful of trade representatives and cultural liaisons Earth maintained within various council departments, and I watched every single one of them stay silent, eyes fixed on their data pads, none of them willing to be the first to speak against a resolution that so clearly had momentum behind it. I understood their silence. I had felt that exact same silence pressing down on my own throat more times than I cared to remember, in briefing rooms where speaking up meant risking your career, or worse, risking being labeled as difficult, as someone who could not be trusted to follow orders without question. But I was not a diplomat worried about my next posting. I was a retired soldier who had already given the council everything I had to give, and I had nothing left to lose by opening my mouth. The presiding voice called for initial statements from member delegations before the vote would proceed, and one after another, representatives from a dozen different species rose to offer their support for the resolution, their reasoning varying slightly in language, but identical in substance. Order must be maintained. Precedent must be respected. Weakness invites further defiance. I sat through each speech with my hands folded, my breathing steady, cataloging every argument the same way I once cataloged enemy positions before a mission, understanding that knowing exactly what you were up against was the first and most important step toward surviving it. It was Grace Ellery, of all people, who finally leaned toward me from 2 seats away during a brief pause in proceedings, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir," she said, using a title I had not heard applied to myself in 20 years, "you should say something. Earth's official delegation is not going to speak against this." They never do. I looked at her carefully, this young officer who had greeted me at the ramp only hours earlier with nervous eyes and a datapad full of protocol rules, and I saw something in her expression that reminded me, uncomfortably, of myself at that age. Before I understood exactly how much silence cost. "I am not part of the official delegation," I reminded her quietly. "I am an observer." She shook her head, just slightly, just enough. "You are still human," she said, "and right now, you are the only human in this room, not afraid to look angry about it." Her words settled into me like a weight dropping into still water, sending ripples outward that reached every corner of my mind at once. She was right, and worse, I knew she was right, and I hated how simple she had made it sound, because nothing about speaking in that chamber was simple. Not for me, not with everything I carried into that room whether I wanted to or not. The presiding voice called for a final round of statements before the vote, and I felt my own pulse quicken, in a way I had not experienced since my last mission, a strange, electric mixture of dread and readiness that I recognized instantly, even after 20 years away from it. I raised my hand, slowly, deliberately, and I watched the reaction ripple across the chamber before the presiding voice even acknowledged me. Ivrena's eyebrows lifted just slightly. The Corveth delegate's mechanical eyes narrowed in something between curiosity and irritation. Even the ancient, unreadable presiding voice seemed to pause for half a second longer than necessary before speaking. "Observer Hale," they said, "you may address the chamber." I felt every single eye in that vast room settle onto me at once, and for one brief, unsteady heartbeat, I understood exactly how exposed a person could feel, standing perfectly still, in the middle of an open field, with nowhere to take cover. But I had stood in worse places than this. I had stood in places where the ground itself tried to kill you, where every second of hesitation meant one more person did not make it home. This chamber, for all its polished stone and shimmering light, was nothing compared to that, and I reminded myself of that fact as I rose slowly from my seat. I did not rush my words. I had learned long ago that rushing only made a room believe you were nervous, and nervous men did not get listened to in rooms like this one. I let the silence stretch just a moment longer than was comfortable, long enough that a few delegates shifted in their seats, unused to waiting on a human they had already dismissed as insignificant. Then I spoke, and my voice, low and steady, carried across that chamber without needing to be raised at all. "I have a question," I said, and I noticed immediately that this was not the opening anyone in that room had expected. "Has anyone in this chamber actually spoken to the people of Meridian's Rest? Not their trade representatives, not their regional authority, the actual settlers, the families. Has a single delegate in this room sat across a table from a farmer on that world and asked them why they picked up a tool to defend their home?" A long silence followed, heavier than any silence I had felt since walking through those doors, and I let it stretch, because silence, in my experience, was often more honest than words. The Corvette delegate finally broke it, his tone carrying a note of impatience that had not been there before. "The details of individual grievances are not relevant to matters of council order," he said. "Order is order." I nodded slowly, as if considering his point with genuine respect, before responding in a voice that remained perfectly calm. "That is an interesting philosophy," I said, "coming from someone about to authorize a fleet to enforce it with force against 40,000 people, whose grievances you have just admitted you find irrelevant." A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the chamber at that. Not quite gasps, but something close. The sound of a room realizing it was witnessing something it had not expected to witness. Ivrena rose again, her expression carefully composed, though I noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that told me my words had landed somewhere she had not anticipated. "Observer Hale," she said, "your passion is noted, but passion is not policy. The Council has managed colonial disputes for centuries using established procedure. I would suggest you trust the process rather than question it after only a few hours in this chamber." I let a small, humorless smile touch my lips, the same expression I used to wear right before delivering news that no commanding officer wanted to hear. "I trust the process just fine," I said. "I have simply learned, the hard way, exactly what that process is capable of producing when it moves faster than the truth can catch up to it. And before anyone in this chamber tells me again how many centuries of experience they have managing situations like this one, I would like to remind everyone present that humanity has been a member of this council for less than half a century, and in that short time, we have already learned exactly what waiting for your procedures costs in human lives." I paused there, letting the weight of that sentence settle fully into the room before I continued, because I understood, even as the words left my mouth, that I had just opened a door I could not easily close again. The presiding voice raised a hand, requesting order as several delegates began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a dozen different languages that the translators struggled to keep pace with. "Observer Hale," the presiding voice said, once quiet had mostly returned, "you speak as though this council has failed humanity before." I felt the entire chamber lean forward, almost imperceptibly, sensing that whatever I said next would matter far more than anything spoken in the 2 hours before it. I thought about Kes Verith Prime, about the names I still remembered without ever meaning to, about 11 months of silence while good people ran out of options one by one. "I do not speak as though this council has failed humanity before," I said quietly. "I speak because I was there when it did." I watched several delegates exchange uncertain glances, clearly unfamiliar with whatever history I was referring to, while others, older members whose species I did not yet recognize, went suddenly and completely still, as though a memory long buried had just been dragged back into the light. I understood then, with total clarity, that not everyone in that room had forgotten Kes Verith Prime. Some of them, I suspected, remembered it perfectly well, and had simply hoped no one would ever be foolish enough to bring it up again. The presiding voice's expression, if it could even be called that, seemed to shift slightly, something unreadable passing behind those ancient eyes. "Explain," they said simply, and I felt the entire chamber hold its breath around that single word. waiting to see whether I would step back from the edge I had just walked myself toward, or whether I would keep walking straight into whatever waited on the other side. I looked around the room one final time before I spoke again, taking in every face, every species, every ancient empire represented in gold and silk and armored plating, and I thought about how none of them, not one, truly understood what it meant to wait 11 months for a vote, while your friends bled out in the dark. I intended, before this session ended, to make sure they understood exactly that, whether they wanted to hear it or not. Kesvereth Prime, I began, was a mining colony on the edge of contested space, established less than 2 years after humanity first joined this council. Fewer than 6,000 people lived there, mostly engineers and their families, drawn out to the frontier by the promise of good work and a quiet life. I was 26 years old when I was deployed there, assigned to a small detachment sent to help secure the colony's perimeter after local scans detected unusual activity along the border of a neighboring system. Nobody expected trouble. The briefing I received called the mission routine, and for the first 3 weeks, routine was exactly what it was. I paused there, watching the chamber, and I noticed that even the delegates who had seemed bored only minutes earlier were now leaning forward, caught in something they could not quite name yet. I continued, keeping my voice level, refusing to let the old weight in my chest bleed into my tone, because I had learned long ago that a shaking voice invited pity, and pity was not what I wanted from this room. I wanted understanding, and understanding required steadiness. On the 22nd day, I said, an unregistered fleet crossed into the system without warning. Not a council fleet. Not anyone with a name we recognized. They opened fire on our orbital station before a single hail had even been answered. We lost contact with half our forward positions within the first 10 minutes. I remember because I was timing it on an old wrist device that stopped working exactly 11 minutes and 40 seconds after the first impact, and I still have that device in a drawer at home, stopped forever at that exact number, because some part of me could never bring myself to fix it or throw it away. A few delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I noticed the Corvith delegate had gone very still, his mechanical eyes fixed on me without their earlier impatience. I did not know, at that moment, whether his stillness meant he was moved by what I was saying or simply calculating how to respond to it, and I decided it did not matter either way. The facts would speak for themselves, whether he chose to listen with his heart or only with his strategy. We requested immediate support, I continued. Standard procedure, the same procedure this council still follows today, required that any request for military intervention from a member species be reviewed by a full council vote before authorization could be granted. I understand the reasoning behind that procedure. I understood it then too, even as a frightened 26-year-old soldier trying to keep my unit alive. Nobody wanted a single desperate call for help to drag the entire galaxy into unnecessary war. That is a reasonable fear, and I do not stand here today asking anyone to abandon caution entirely. But I do stand here to tell you what caution costs when it moves too slowly, I said, and for the first time since I had begun speaking, I allowed a small edge to enter my voice. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, something earned. Our request sat in review for 11 months. 11 months, while a colony of 6,000 people held a perimeter meant to protect, at most, 200 trained personnel, because that mining station never anticipated needing a real defense force. 11 months, while every single procedural committee debated jurisdiction, precedent, and the risk of provoking a wider conflict, as though the conflict had not already arrived and settled itself directly on top of us. I want to be clear, I said, looking directly at Ivrena now, because I remembered reading her name in old records, though I did not yet say so aloud. I am not here to blame any single delegate seated in this chamber today for decisions made before most of you held your current positions. I understand institutions carry forward the weight of choices made by people long since retired or passed on. But institutions are made of choices, over and over again, and I am asking this council, today, right now, whether it has actually learned anything from that particular choice, or whether it is simply preparing to make the same one again, dressed up in slightly different words. The presiding voice's ancient voice cut through the growing murmur in the chamber. Continue, Observer Hale, they said, and I heard something in that instruction that had not been there before. Not simple procedural permission, but something closer to genuine attention. I nodded slightly and continued, because I understood I had not yet reached the part of the story that mattered most. By the 6th month, I said, we had lost contact with 3 of our 5 forward positions entirely. Not damaged, not retreating, gone, along with every soldier stationed there, whose names I still remember in order, because reciting them became something I did quietly to myself during the long nights when sleep would not come. Laura Bennett's cousin was among the settlers on that station, though I did not learn that connection until many years later, back on Earth, sharing a drink with a woman who had lost family she never even had the chance to properly grieve, because official records took years to confirm what those of us on the ground already knew within days. By the 9th month, I continued, the remaining defenders were rationing ammunition, manufactured from scavenged mining equipment, because official council supply lines required the same review process as military intervention, and nobody had approved emergency resupply for a conflict that, on paper, technically did not yet officially exist. We were defending our home with tools built for extracting ore, because that was what we had, and because giving up was never something any of us considered, not for one single moment, no matter how impossible the odds became. I let that sentence hang in the air, watching it settle over the chamber like a weight none of them had expected to carry into this session. Several delegates would not meet my eyes anymore. Others watched me with an intensity that told me they were recalculating something, some internal assumption about who I was and what I represented, that they had walked into this chamber already certain of, an assumption that was now, slowly and visibly, coming apart. By the 11th month, I said, my voice steady but quieter now, deliberately quieter, because I had learned that a quiet voice in a moment like this carried further than a loud one ever could. By the 11th month, when the council finally approved intervention, there were 1,200 defenders left on that station, out of an original force of just over 200, combined with local volunteers who picked up weapons, because there was simply no one else left to do it. When relief forces finally arrived, they did not find a battle in progress. They found a graveyard, and a handful of survivors who had run so low on hope that some of them did not initially believe the ships arriving in orbit were actually friendly. I was one of those survivors, I said simply, and I heard the smallest sound ripple through the chamber, something between a collective breath being held and a collective breath being released. I do not tell you this story to ask for sympathy. I am not asking anyone in this room to feel sorry for me or for the friends I lost during those 11 months. I am telling you this story because it is the exact same story I am watching this council prepare to write again today, on a colony called Meridian's Rest. Except this time, the delay everyone here is discussing is not accidental. It is deliberate. You are not debating whether to help those people fast enough. You are debating how quickly you can send a fleet to enforce order against them. The chamber remained silent for a long moment, and I let it stay that way, because some silences needed to be respected rather than filled. Finally, the Corvette delegate spoke again, though his mechanical voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, replaced by something more careful, more measured. "Observer Hale," he said, "your experience is noted, and this council does not take it lightly. But surely you understand the situations are not identical." Kesvereth Prime faced an external threat. Meridian's Rest faces an internal breakdown of order. These are different problems requiring different solutions. I looked at him steadily, and I let a moment pass before answering, because I wanted my next words to land with their full weight, rather than get lost in the momentum of an argument. "Are they truly so different?" I asked. "Or is it simply easier to authorize force quickly, when the people on the receiving end of that force cannot shoot back at whoever gave the order?" A sharp silence followed that question, and I saw more than one delegate exchange uneasy glances, the kind of glances that told me I had touched something true, something that made people uncomfortable, precisely because it was true. Ivrena rose once more, and this time her composure seemed slightly less certain than before, though she recovered quickly, her voice smooth and practiced. "Observer Hale," she said, "I understand your history informs your perspective, and I respect the sacrifice you and your fellow soldiers made on Kesvereth Prime. But this council cannot make policy based on individual grief, however genuine. We must consider the stability of the wider galactic community, a responsibility that requires difficult decisions made with clear eyes, rather than emotional testimony." I nodded slowly, as though considering her words with genuine respect, before responding in a tone that remained perfectly level. "I agree completely," I said. "That policy should not be built on grief alone. That is exactly why I am not asking this council to feel sorry for anyone. I am asking this council to actually look at the facts before authorizing a fleet against 40,000 people, the same way it eventually looked at the facts on Kesvereth Prime. Except this time, I would like that clear-eyed examination to happen before the graveyard, not after it." I felt the room shift again, subtly but unmistakably, the balance of attention moving away from procedural comfort and toward something rawer, something the delegates in that chamber were clearly not accustomed to confronting directly. I understood, even as I stood there, that I had not yet finished what I came into that room to say, and I understood, with equal clarity, that whatever I said next would determine far more than the fate of a single vote. The presiding voice allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before speaking again, and when they did, their tone carried a new weight, something that told me even this ancient, unreadable being had been moved, at least slightly, by what I had said. "Observer Hale," they announced. "You have raised serious concerns regarding this resolution." Before the vote proceeds, the chamber will hear any further statements relevant to the matter. I felt my pulse steady rather than quicken, because I understood this moment for exactly what it was, a door left open, and I intended to walk through it fully rather than stand hesitating at the threshold. "I have one more thing to say," I said, and I made sure my voice reached every corner of that vast chamber, without needing to rise above a calm, even register. "When Earth first joined this council, we did not join as subjects asking for protection. We joined as equals, signing a charter that every species in this room also signed. A charter built on the promise of mutual respect and mutual restraint. I have read that charter more times than I can count, sitting in quiet rooms trying to understand exactly what it was my friends died defending. Nowhere in that charter does it say that member worlds forfeit the right to question council authority, simply because their population happens to be smaller, or newer, or less politically connected than the empires who have sat in these seats for 1,000 years. Several delegates shifted at that, and I noticed the Corveth delegate's mechanical eyes narrow slightly, though he said nothing yet. I continued, before anyone could interrupt, because I had learned that momentum, once built, needed to be carried through, rather than paused. "I am not here to threaten this council," I said. "Humanity has never once broken a treaty it signed with this body, not in 50 years of membership, through wars and disputes and disagreements that would have shattered lesser alliances. We have honored every single agreement we made, even when honoring it cost us dearly. I would ask that this council extend humanity the same basic respect it claims to extend to every member species, the respect of being heard before being judged." Ivrena's expression had shifted again, something calculating behind her earlier composure, and when she spoke, her voice carried a slight edge that had not been present before. "And if this council does not extend that respect, Observer Hale," she asked, "what exactly do you propose humanity will do about it?" I felt every eye in the chamber snap toward me at that question, sensing, correctly, that this was the moment the entire session had been quietly building toward without anyone fully realizing it. I let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed before I answered, because I understood that my next words needed to be chosen with the same precision I once used choosing a position on a battlefield, where one wrong step could change everything that followed. "I am not proposing that humanity will do anything," I said finally, my voice remaining perfectly level, perfectly calm. "I am simply telling this chamber what history has already shown, over and over again, about what happens to fleets and forces that assume a smaller population means a weaker resolve. I am not describing a threat. I am describing a pattern, one this council has apparently not yet learned to recognize, despite ample opportunity to do so." The chamber went very still at that, a stillness with a different texture than the silence before it, sharper, more alert. I noticed several older delegates, species I still could not identify by name, exchange glances that carried something close to recognition, as though I had just referenced a memory some of them still carried quietly, even after all these years. I decided, in that moment, that it was time to make certain everyone in that room understood exactly what pattern I was referring to, rather than leaving it as a vague implication they could dismiss once I sat back down. 15 years ago, I said, I stood in this exact chamber, though not in the seat I occupy today. I stood on this same floor as a junior military liaison, present only to answer procedural questions about troop deployment logistics. I was not scheduled to speak that day either, but I watched this council debate a resolution eerily similar to the one before us now, concerning a small mining outpost that had refused certain trade terms imposed upon it without negotiation. I watched delegates in seats very much like the ones many of you occupy today argue that a measured show of force would prevent greater conflict later. I remember, because I was the officer responsible for briefing the fleet that eventually enforced that resolution. I paused there, letting the weight of what I had just revealed settle fully into the room, watching realization dawn slowly on the faces of delegates old enough to remember that day, and confusion settle onto the faces of those too young to have witnessed it directly. That outpost, I continued, had a population of just over 3,000 people. When the fleet I helped brief arrived to enforce the Council's measured resolution, they encountered resistance far more organized and far more determined than anyone had predicted, because desperate people defending their homes very rarely behave the way distant committees expect them to behave on paper. The resulting conflict lasted 4 days and cost the lives of nearly 600 people, roughly evenly split between defenders and the enforcing fleet. A number that, I imagine, exists in some archived report gathering dust in a records office somewhere in this very building. I remember standing in this chamber afterward, I said, my voice hardening just slightly, allowing the smallest edge of old anger to surface, because I judged that this particular moment called for honesty over careful diplomacy. I remember saying, in far less measured words than I am using today, that this council had just demonstrated exactly why smaller populations across this galaxy do not trust its promises of fair treatment. I was removed from this chamber shortly afterward for speaking out of turn. I imagine some of the older delegates in this room remember that particular incident rather clearly, even if they have chosen, until now, not to mention it aloud. A long, uncomfortable silence followed that admission, and I watched Ivrena's composure falter, just for a moment, before she recovered it, though not quite as smoothly as before. I do recall that incident, she said finally, her voice quieter than it had been throughout the entire session. I did not realize the officer in question and the observer standing before us today were the same person. I nodded once, simply, without any satisfaction in the admission, because satisfaction was not what I felt in that moment. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion that comes from watching history repeat itself in slow motion, while everyone around you insists it is somehow different this time. I am not the same person I was 15 years ago, I said quietly. I am older, and I hope wiser, and I have spent those 15 years trying to understand why this council keeps arriving at the same conclusions, despite watching those conclusions fail, repeatedly, in exactly the same way. I do not believe it is because the delegates in this chamber are cruel people. I believe it is because distance makes suffering abstract, and abstract suffering is very easy to vote against without ever truly feeling the weight of that vote. I am here today because I refuse to let this council treat Meridian's Rest as another abstraction, filed away in a report that future observers will read 15 years from now, with the same quiet horror I feel reading about Kes Vareth Prime and that mining outpost today. The presiding voice remained silent for a long moment, their ancient, unreadable eyes fixed on me with an intensity I could not fully interpret. Finally, they spoke, and their voice carried a gravity that seemed to settle over the entire chamber like a physical weight. Observer Hale, they said, you have given this council a great deal to consider. Before we proceed to any vote, I believe it is appropriate to allow a brief recess, during which member delegations may review the testimony provided today and consult with their governments accordingly. A murmur of surprise rippled through the chamber at that announcement, because emergency sessions, I would learn later from Grace, almost never paused for recess once a vote had been formally proposed. I understood, standing there, that something had genuinely shifted in that room, something I had not fully expected to achieve when I first raised my hand to speak. I did not allow myself to feel triumphant, because I had learned long ago that a single recess changed nothing by itself. It only opened a window, and windows, in my experience, could close just as quickly as they opened if nobody stood ready to hold them in place. As the chamber began to empty around me, delegates rising from their seats in small clusters of quiet, urgent conversation, I remained seated for a long moment, watching the room I had just upended settle into something new and uncertain. Grace slipped into the seat beside me, her earlier nervousness replaced by something that looked almost like awe. "I have never seen anyone do that before," she said quietly. "Speak to this entire chamber like that, and have them actually stop and listen." I looked at her, and I thought about all the names I still carried with me, the ones from Kesvereth Prime, the ones from that mining outpost 15 years earlier, the ones I did not yet know from Meridian's Rest, and I understood that this recess was only the beginning of whatever came next, not the end of it. "We are not finished," I told her quietly, my eyes fixed on the doors through which Ivrena and the Corveth delegate had just exited, already deep in urgent, private conversation. "This chamber has learned to pause before charging forward, and that alone is more than I expected when I walked through those doors this morning. But pausing is not the same as changing course entirely, and I intend to make certain, before this session ends, that the people of Meridian's Rest are given the chance to speak for themselves, the way nobody ever gave the people of Kesvereth Prime that same chance, until it was far too late to matter." The recess lasted only 2 hours, but it felt far longer, stretched thin by the strange electric tension that had settled over the entire grand spire the moment word spread of what had happened inside the main chamber. Grace led me through a side corridor toward a small private lounge reserved for observers, and along the way I noticed delegates from at least 4 different species pause mid-conversation to watch me pass, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to something closer to suspicion. I had expected exactly this. A person does not stand in front of the Galactic Council and speak the way I had just spoken without becoming, at least temporarily, the single most interesting figure in the entire building. The lounge itself was quiet when we entered, softly lit, with a wide viewport overlooking the slow, endless drift of stars beyond the station. I sat down near the window and let myself breathe properly for the first time since stepping through those enormous doors that morning, my hands finally unclenching from the tight fists they had apparently formed without my noticing. Grace poured 2 cups of something warm from a dispenser along the wall and handed one to me without asking whether I wanted it, a small kindness that I appreciated more than she probably realized. "You should be careful," she said quietly, sitting across from me, her earlier awe now tempered by something more cautious. "What you did in there was powerful, but powerful things attract attention from people who do not want them repeated." I understood exactly what she meant, and I nodded slowly, wrapping my hands around the warm cup, more for the comfort of the motion than for the drink itself. I had spent enough years reading Dangerous Rooms to recognize when I had made myself a target, and I had absolutely made myself one today, whether I regretted it or not. The door to the lounge opened without warning less than 20 minutes later, and I looked up to see the Corveth delegate standing in the doorway, his armored frame filling most of the space, his mechanical eyes fixed directly on me with an intensity that made Grace sit up straighter beside me. He stepped inside alone, the door sliding shut behind him, and for a moment, the 3 of us simply regarded one another in silence, the kind of silence that carries far more weight than any words spoken into it. "Observer Hale," he said finally, his voice lower now than it had been in the chamber, carrying none of its earlier performative confidence. "I have come to speak with you plainly, without an audience watching every word for weakness." I gestured toward the empty seat across from me, keeping my own expression neutral, giving away nothing of the readiness building quietly beneath my calm exterior. He remained standing instead, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the low table between us. "You have made this session far more complicated than it needed to be," he said. "The resolution regarding Meridian's Rest was a simple matter before your testimony. Now half the chamber is questioning decades of established procedure based on the emotional account of a single soldier." I felt Grace tense beside me, but I kept my own posture relaxed, deliberately unhurried, because I understood that reacting with equal intensity would only confirm whatever assumption he had walked in here believing about me. "I did not make this session complicated," I said quietly. "I simply made it honest. Those are very different things, and I suspect you know that better than you are currently letting on." His mechanical eyes narrowed slightly at that, and for a long moment he said nothing, apparently recalculating whatever approach he had originally planned to take with me. When he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted, less confrontational, more probing, as though testing the exact boundaries of what I was and was not willing to say. "Tell me honestly, Observer Hale," he said. "What is it you actually want from this council? Do you imagine Meridian's Rest simply gets to defy trade agreements indefinitely, with no consequence whatsoever? Do you believe order maintains itself without occasional enforcement?" I considered his question carefully before answering, because it was, buried beneath its confrontational framing, a genuinely fair question, one I owed a genuinely honest answer. "I do not believe order maintains itself without effort," I said. "I served for years precisely because I believe some things are worth defending, sometimes with force. But I also believe force used as a first resort, rather than a last one, is not order at all. It is simply violence wearing order's uniform. What I want from this council is very simple. I want someone from Meridian's Rest given the chance to explain, in their own words, why they picked up arms, before this chamber decides that explanation does not matter. That is not an unreasonable request. That is the bare minimum any fair process requires." The Corveth delegate studied me for a long moment, his expression, as much as I could read it through unfamiliar features, unreadable in a way that made the silence between us stretch uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter still. "You spoke of patterns earlier, in the chamber. Patterns of fleets underestimating smaller populations. I would remind you, Observer Hale, that patterns run in more than one direction. Humanity is young in this council, and history has not been kind to young species who mistake a single moment of attention for lasting influence. I would advise caution, for your own sake, and for the sake of the delegation you represent." I met his gaze steadily, refusing to let even the faintest flicker of intimidation show on my face, because I understood exactly what this conversation actually was, beneath its careful diplomatic phrasing. It was not advice. It was a warning, delivered quietly, away from witnesses who might later confirm exactly how it had been phrased. I let a moment pass before responding, choosing my words with the same deliberate care I had used in the chamber itself. "I appreciate the concern," I said, my voice remaining level and calm, despite the current running beneath it. "But I would gently suggest that you are misunderstanding what I actually said today. I did not describe a threat this council should fear. I described a pattern this council should learn from, for its own benefit as much as for humanity's. Every single empire in this chamber, including whichever one you represent, has at some point in its long history underestimated an opponent it believed too small or too new to matter. And every single one of those empires eventually paid a price for that underestimation. I am not telling you humanity intends to become that price today. I am telling you that this council keeps setting up situations where somebody eventually has to." His mechanical eyes flickered, something almost like genuine surprise passing behind them, as though he had expected a very different response from me, something more easily dismissed as either fear or bravado, rather than the calm, measured statement I had actually given him. He remained silent for a long moment, and I let that silence stand, unwilling to fill it with anything further, because I understood that the strongest position in this conversation belonged to whoever needed to speak least. "You are an unusual soldier," he said finally, and there was something in his tone that had not been present before, a grudging note of respect buried beneath the lingering wariness. "Most humans I have encountered in this council speak either with excessive caution or excessive aggression. You appear to speak with neither." I inclined my head slightly, accepting the observation without either agreeing or disagreeing with it outright. "I have had a long time to learn the difference between the two," I said. "Most of that learning happened in places I would not wish on anyone in this chamber, including you." He turned toward the door, pausing just before he reached it, his broad armored frame briefly silhouetted against the soft light from the corridor beyond. "The vote will proceed within the hour," he said, without turning back to face me fully. "Whatever influence your testimony has purchased, Observer Hale, I would advise you to spend it wisely." Then he was gone, the door sliding shut behind him, leaving Grace and me alone once more in the quiet lounge, the distant stars still drifting silently beyond the viewport, as though nothing in the universe had changed at all, despite everything that had just passed between us in that small, tense room. Grace let out a breath she had apparently been holding the entire time. "That was terrifying," she said quietly. "He looked ready to remove you from this station personally." I allowed myself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one since arriving at the Grand Spire that morning. "He was testing me," I said, trying to see whether what I said in that chamber was conviction or performance. I believe I gave him an honest answer either way, and I suspect that is more unsettling to men like him than any threat I could have made instead. I stood slowly, my bad knee protesting the movement after sitting still for so long, and walked toward the viewport, looking out at the vast, silent drift of stars beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, invisible at this distance, a small world called Meridian's Rest continued turning, its 40,000 people entirely unaware that their fate was currently being decided in careful, quiet conversations inside a building most of them would never see in their entire lives. I thought about the woman I had briefly imagined earlier, some unnamed farmer standing at the edge of her land, uncertain whether the next ship arriving in her sky would bring help or harm. I intended to make absolutely certain, before this day ended, that the answer to that question would be decided honestly, rather than decided for the convenience of people who would never have to live with the consequences of getting it wrong. Grace joined me at the window, quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you think it worked?" she asked. "Do you think they will actually listen?" I considered the question carefully before answering, because I owed her, and myself, an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "I do not know," I said finally. "But I know that silence has never once changed a vote in that chamber. Not in 50 years of humanity sitting quietly in the corner, hoping not to draw attention. Today, at least, they heard something true, whether they choose to act on it or not. That has to count for something, even if it is only the beginning of a much longer fight." When the doors to the main chamber opened again, the atmosphere inside had changed in a way I could feel the instant I stepped through them, a heaviness in the air that had not been there before the recess, as though the entire room had spent those 2 hours quietly rearranging itself around something it had not expected to confront. I took my seat, and I noticed immediately that several delegates who had avoided looking at me earlier now watched me openly, their expressions no longer carrying the same easy dismissal from before. The presiding voice called the session back to order, and the murmur of a dozen overlapping conversations died away slowly, reluctantly, as though the room itself was unwilling to let go of whatever had been discussed during the break. "Before we resume formal proceedings," the presiding voice announced, "a request has been submitted by several delegations for additional testimony regarding the human perspective on colonial enforcement. Observer Hale, you are recognized once more, should you wish to continue." I rose to my feet, feeling the familiar weight of 1,000 eyes settle onto me again, though this time the weight felt different, less like judgment and more like genuine, uncertain attention. I understood that whatever I said next carried more consequence than anything I had spoken before the recess, because a door had been opened, and doors left standing open too long had a way of quietly closing themselves again, if nobody walked through with purpose. "Before I continue," I said, "I would like to address something directly, because I believe it deserves to be said plainly rather than implied. Several delegates in this chamber have suggested, both openly and in quieter conversations during our recess, that my testimony represents nothing more than one bitter veteran's grievance, unsuitable as a foundation for council policy. I understand that framing, and I understand why it feels safer to dismiss a single voice than to reconsider decades of established procedure. But I would like to ask this chamber a question before we proceed any further, and I would genuinely appreciate an honest answer, rather than a comfortable one." I paused, letting the silence stretch, watching the room hold its breath along with me. "How many delegates seated in this chamber today," I asked, "have personally served in any military capacity, in any conflict, for any species represented here? I want a show of hands, if this council is willing to give me one." The silence that followed was profound, heavier than any silence I had experienced since walking through those doors that morning. I watched carefully, counting, and across that entire vast chamber, filled with hundreds of delegates representing dozens of ancient and powerful civilizations, exactly 3 hands rose slowly into the air. I let that number settle over the room before speaking again. 3, I said quietly. "Out of everyone gathered here today to decide whether to send armed forces against 40,000 civilians, 3 delegates have ever personally experienced what that decision actually means for the people living through it. I am not saying that combat experience is required to hold wisdom, or that every decision in this chamber must be made only by those who have served, but I am asking this council to sit, honestly, with how easy it becomes to authorize violence in the abstract, when none of the people voting for it have ever had to carry its weight afterward. Ivrena rose slowly, her expression carefully composed once more, though I noticed something different in her posture now, less certain than before the recess. "Observer Hale," she said, her voice measured, "I would remind this chamber that wisdom in governance does not require personal combat experience, any more than a physician requires personal experience of every illness they treat." I nodded slowly, acknowledging the point before responding, because I had anticipated exactly this argument and had spent part of the recess quietly preparing my answer to it. "That is a fair comparison," I said, "and I mean that honestly rather than dismissively. But I would ask this chamber to consider one further detail about physicians. A physician who has never experienced illness themselves still speaks directly to their patients before deciding on treatment. They do not authorize a procedure based solely on a report written by someone who has never met the person lying on the table. That is the entire difference I am asking this council to consider today. Not whether you have personal combat experience, but whether you are willing to hear directly from the people whose lives you are about to decide, rather than deciding purely on reports assembled by trade authorities, who have never once set foot on Meridian's Rest." A new voice entered the conversation then, unexpected and quiet, one of the three delegates whose hand had risen only moments earlier. I turned to see an elderly figure from a species I still did not recognize, their skin deeply lined, their eyes carrying the particular weariness I had seen in the mirror more times than I cared to count. "Observer Hale speaks truly," the elder said, their voice frail but carrying clearly across the silent chamber. "I served in the Cassian border conflicts, 3 centuries ago by your reckoning, though barely a generation by mine. I have watched this council authorize force against smaller worlds many times since then, always with confidence, always certain of the outcome, and I have watched those confident predictions fail more often than this chamber cares to remember in its official records." I felt something loosen slightly in my chest at those words, the particular relief of discovering you are not entirely alone in a room that had, until that moment, felt overwhelmingly against me. The elder continued, their voice growing slightly stronger as they spoke. "I do not say this to embarrass my colleagues," they said. "I say it because Observer Hale has done this chamber a genuine service today, however uncomfortable that service may feel. He has reminded us that authority without accountability becomes cruelty, no matter how politely that cruelty is phrased in official resolutions." The Corveth delegate shifted in his seat, his mechanical frame betraying a restlessness that had not been present during his private conversation with me earlier. "This is precisely the kind of sentimental thinking that leads to chaos," he said, though his earlier confidence had noticeably diminished. "If this council requires personal testimony from every affected population before authorizing any enforcement action, we will find ourselves paralyzed by process, unable to respond to genuine threats when they arise." I turned toward him, keeping my voice level despite the sharpness of his objection. "I am not asking for paralysis," I said. "I am asking for one conversation, with representatives of Meridian's Rest, before this chamber authorizes force against them. Not 11 months of review, not endless procedural delay. One conversation, conducted honestly, before deciding that 40,000 people deserve armed enforcement, rather than genuine dialogue. If this council cannot manage even that small measure of restraint, then I would suggest the problem lies far deeper than any single resolution before us today." The presiding voice remained silent for a long moment, their ancient eyes moving slowly across the chamber, weighing something I could not fully perceive. When they finally spoke, their voice carried a gravity that silenced every remaining murmur in the room. "This council has heard compelling testimony today," they said, "from both Observer Hale and from Elder Vashti, whose experience carries weight few in this chamber can claim. I am inclined to agree that a resolution of this magnitude deserves more than the process currently before us." A murmur rippled through the chamber at that, and I felt something cautious and fragile stir in my chest, not quite hope, but something close enough to it that I did not trust myself to name it yet. The presiding voice raised a hand, calling for silence once more. "However," they continued, "this council cannot simply delay every enforcement action indefinitely, based on the possibility of future dialogue. We must weigh the cost of delay against the cost of premature action, the same difficult calculation this body has always faced." I felt the fragile hope in my chest tighten slightly. sensing that the moment had arrived where everything I had said might either matter completely or matter not at all, depending on whatever came next. I looked around the chamber one final time, at Ivrena's carefully guarded expression, at the Corveth delegate's restless posture, at Elder Vashti's steady, weathered gaze, and I understood that I had done everything within my power to change the direction of this room. Whatever happened next was no longer entirely within my control, and after everything I had lived through, I had made an uneasy peace, long ago, with the limits of what a single voice could actually accomplish, even when that voice spoke as loudly and as honestly as mine had spoken today. The presiding voice called for a formal vote on an amended proposal, one that had emerged from a flurry of quiet negotiations during the final minutes, before the chamber settled back into order. Instead of immediate authorization for a pacification fleet, the amended resolution called for a delegation, small and unarmed, to travel to Meridian's Rest and meet directly with representatives of the settlement before any further action would be considered. I listened to the proposal read aloud, and I felt my chest tighten with something I had not allowed myself to feel since stepping into that chamber that morning, a cautious, fragile relief that refused to fully settle until I saw the actual outcome for myself. Voting began immediately, each delegation casting their decision through small illuminated panels built into their seats, the results displayed on a massive screen above the presiding voice's platform for the entire chamber to witness together. I watched the numbers climb slowly, delegation by delegation, my pulse steady, but my attention absolute, cataloging every vote the way I had once cataloged incoming fire, understanding that a single moment of distraction could mean missing something crucial. Ivrena's vote appeared on the screen first among the major delegations, and I felt a brief flash of surprise when her panel registered in favor of the amended proposal rather than against it. I would learn later, from Grace, that the Thessery had a long institutional memory regarding conflicts that spiraled out of proportion to their original cause, and that my testimony had apparently touched something in Ivrena that her earlier composure had not revealed. The Corveth delegate's vote followed shortly after, registering against the amendment, exactly as I had expected, though I noticed his vote did not carry the same aggressive certainty his earlier speeches had suggested it would. One by one, delegation after delegation registered their votes, the tally climbing steadily toward the threshold required for passage. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my breathing deliberately even, refusing to let the mounting tension show on my face, even as my heart pounded harder with every passing second. Grace sat rigid beside me, her own hands gripping the edge of her seat, unable to fully hide the anxiety I understood perfectly well, because I felt an echo of that same anxiety running through my own chest, no matter how carefully I controlled its outward expression. The final vote appeared on the screen, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The amended resolution had passed, not by an overwhelming margin, but by enough, a clear majority in favor of sending unarmed representatives to Meridian's Rest for direct dialogue before any further military action would even be considered. I felt something release in my chest, slow and deep, a tension I had been carrying since that first alarm buzzed on my wrist device early that morning. So long ago now it felt like it belonged to an entirely different day. The presiding voice announced the results formally, their ancient voice carrying clearly across the now murmuring chamber. This council recognizes the passage of the amended resolution, they said. A diplomatic delegation will depart for Meridian's Rest within the week, tasked with direct engagement rather than enforcement. I remained seated for a long moment after the announcement, letting the reality of it settle fully into my bones, watching delegates around the chamber rise and begin their quiet conversations once more, the ordinary business of the council reasserting itself, even after everything that had just happened within these walls. Grace turned to me, her expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet triumph. "You did that," she said softly. I shook my head slowly, because I understood, with total clarity, that I had not done this alone, not by any measure. "I gave them a reason to pause," I said. Elder Vashti gave them a reason to trust that pause. And enough delegates in that chamber were willing to actually listen, rather than simply vote the way they always had before. That is not something I accomplished by myself. That is something this entire room accomplished together, even if it took considerable pushing to get there. As I rose from my seat, preparing to leave the chamber, I noticed Ivrena standing near the exit, apparently waiting, her silver skin catching the chamber's soft light in a way that made her expression difficult to fully read. I approached her slowly, and she inclined her head slightly in something that might have been the closest thing to respect she was willing to openly offer me. "Observer Hale," she said, "your testimony today was more effective than I anticipated when you first walked through those doors this morning. I will admit, I did not expect a soldier to change minds in this chamber, the way skilled diplomats so often fail to do. I did not set out to change minds," I said honestly. "I simply refused to stay silent, while people who will never meet the settlers of Meridian's Rest decided their fate without hearing from them first." She studied me for a long moment, something calculating behind her composed expression, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped low enough that I suspected she did not intend for anyone else nearby to hear it clearly. "You should understand something, Observer Hale," she said quietly. "Today you have made yourself memorable, in a room full of people who have long memories and considerable patience. That can be a valuable thing, or it can be a very costly one, depending entirely on what you choose to do with the attention you have now earned." I met her gaze steadily, refusing to let the warning, wrapped as it was in careful diplomatic phrasing, unsettle the calm I had worked so hard to maintain throughout that entire long day. "I have spent most of my life being memorable to people who wished I was not," I said simply. "I have survived that particular attention before, and I imagine I will survive it again." She held my gaze a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind her ancient eyes, before finally offering the smallest incline of her head and turning to leave the chamber without another word. I watched her go, understanding that whatever alliance or rivalry had just quietly formed between us in that brief exchange would likely define a great deal of what came next, though I could not yet fully predict which direction it would ultimately take. As Ivrena disappeared through the chamber doors, I overheard, quite by accident, a fragment of conversation between her and an aide walking just close enough for my ear's translator to catch it clearly. Her voice was low, meant only for the aide beside her, carrying a tone I recognized instantly as genuine, unguarded concern, rather than the careful diplomatic performance she had maintained throughout the entire session. "Never let one of them speak again unchallenged," she said quietly to her aide, the words carrying a weight that told me she meant them as a serious instruction rather than idle commentary. I stood still for a moment, watching her disappear down the corridor, and I felt a small, tired smile pull at the corner of my mouth, the first genuine smile I had allowed myself since stepping off that transport ship earlier that day. Too late, I thought quietly to myself, watching the doors close behind her retreating figure. I already had. Whatever came next, whatever careful strategies the ancient empires of this council began quietly assembling in response to what had happened in that chamber today, they would be responding to something that had already occurred, a moment that could not be undone simply because it had proven inconvenient to those who preferred humanity to remain quiet and unnoticed in the corner. Grace fell into step beside me as we walked out of the grand spire together, the wide viewports along the corridor showing the same slow, endless drift of stars I had watched earlier from the private lounge, though somehow they looked different to me now, less distant, less indifferent. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked quietly, genuine curiosity replacing the nervousness that had defined her earlier that morning. I considered the question carefully before answering, because I understood she deserved an honest response rather than an easy one. "I do not know if it changes everything," I said, "but I know it changes something, and sometimes something is exactly where every larger change eventually has to begin. 40,000 people on Meridian's Rest will get the chance to speak for themselves before anyone decides their fate without them. That will not fix every problem this council carries, and it will certainly not erase the 11 months I spent watching good people die while committees debated jurisdiction. But it is a door that was not open yesterday, and today, at least, it stands open, waiting to see who has the courage to walk through it next." We reached the transport bay in silence after that, the events of the day settling slowly over both of us, like a weight finally set down after being carried too long. As the ship carrying us away from the grand spire lifted off, I looked back one final time at that impossible structure of light and metal, built by no single species but maintained by all of them, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that I would be called back to that chamber again, and likely far sooner than anyone in that room today would prefer. Ancient empires, I had learned long ago on battlefields I still carried with me every single day. Rarely forget the moment they first felt the ground shift beneath their feet. And today, in that vast, glittering chamber, I had made certain every single one of them felt exactly that.